Ava Brooks, an exhausted 27-year-old black maid struggling with her mother's hospital bills, accidentally spills champagne on the expensive gown of Claudia Harrington at a luxurious Manhattan charity gala. Instead of showing grace, Claudia cruelly mocks her and slaps Ava across the face in front of the entire ballroom. This incident catches the attention of Vincent Moretti, a feared and powerful billionaire. Vincent Moretti inadvertently noticed the silver cross necklace the black maid was wearing and was shocked to realize it was a memento of his late mother, Eleanor Moretti. Ava reveals that Mrs. Eleanor Moretti gifted it to her at the St. Gabriel Hospice, where Ava used to sit with her and comfort her during her lonely final nights. And how does the story end? Please listen along. Sometimes the richest people in the room are the poorest in dignity. The crystal chandeliers above the Grand Regent Ballroom cast warm golden light across marble floors, polished so perfectly they reflected every diamond, every tuxedo, every fake smile in attendance. Manhattan's elite moved through the charity gala with glasses of champagne balanced between manicured fingers, laughing softly beneath the sound of a live violin quartet near the stage. Waiters glided silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays worth more than most Americans made in a month. And among them was Ava Brooks, a 27-year-old black maid working her second double shift that week, trying not to think about the overdue hospital bills sitting on her kitchen counter back in Brooklyn. Her black uniform was simple, pressed carefully that morning in the tiny apartment she shared with her mother. And her natural curls were tied neatly into a low bun beneath the soft ballroom lights. Invisible. That was the rule for people like Ava. Move quietly, smile politely, never attract attention. Especially not in a room filled with powerful people who looked through workers as if they were part of the furniture. Across the ballroom, Claudia Harrington stood near the center table, wrapped in white satin and diamonds that glittered like frozen stars against her pale skin. Everything about her screamed old money, the kind passed down through generations of people who had never worried about rent, groceries, or medical debt. Guests surrounded her constantly, laughing too hard at her jokes, praising every word that left her lips because Claudia Harrington wasn't just wealthy, she was connected. Her family's investment firm had ties to politicians, judges, and men nobody mentioned too loudly in public, men like Vincent Moretti. At the far end of the ballroom, Vincent sat quietly at a private table overlooking the entire event. No loud laughter, no dramatic gestures, just stillness. The kind of stillness that made powerful men lower their voices when they walked past him. At 38 years old, Vincent Moretti had built an empire people whispered about behind closed doors. His charcoal suit fit perfectly across broad shoulders, and the silver watch on his wrist probably cost more than the ballroom pianist's yearly salary. But it wasn't the money that unsettled people. It was his eyes, cold, calm, always watching. Ava tried not to look in his direction as she carried a tray of fresh champagne glasses through the crowd. She had heard stories about Vincent from the kitchen staff, stories about businessmen disappearing after betraying him, stories about judges suddenly changing decisions overnight, stories nobody could prove but everybody believed. Her hands tightened slightly around the tray as a guest stepped backward unexpectedly into her path. The movement was small, barely noticeable, but it was enough. One champagne glass tipped sideways. Golden liquid splashed across the front of Claudia Harrington's white designer gown. Silence swallowed the ballroom. Ava froze instantly. Her pulse crashed against her ribs. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," she whispered quickly, reaching for a napkin with trembling fingers. Claudia looked down slowly at the stain spreading across her dress. Then she looked at Ava. Not like a person looking at another person, more like someone staring at a problem they found disgusting. "Do you have any idea how much this dress costs?" Claudia asked coldly. Ava lowered her eyes. "I apologize, ma'am. It was an accident." A few nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, but nobody stepped in. Nobody ever stepped in. Claudia's lips curled into a sharp smile that never touched her eyes. "Women like you always say that," she said loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear. The ballroom grew painfully quiet. Ava felt dozens of eyes settle onto her. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, but she kept her posture calm, her voice respectful. "I can pay for the cleaning, ma'am?" Soft laughter broke out nearby. Claudia tilted her head slightly. "Pay for it," she repeated mockingly. "Honey, this gown costs more than your entire yearly salary." More laughter. Ava swallowed hard. The sound cut deeper than she wanted to admit. Still, she said nothing, because losing this job would destroy everything waiting for her back home. Claudia stepped closer now, lowering her voice just enough to feel crueler. "Maybe people like you should learn to stay invisible." Then, with one sharp movement, Claudia slapped Ava across the face. The sound echoed through the ballroom louder than the music. Ava stumbled backward, one hand instinctively touching her cheek as the silver tray crashed against the marble floor beside her. Crystal shattered everywhere. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. And at the far end of the ballroom, Vincent Moretti slowly set down his whiskey glass. The sound of Vincent Moretti's whiskey glass touching the table was quiet, but somehow it carried farther than the slap itself. Conversations died instantly. Even the violinists stopped moving their bows across the strings. Ava Brooks stood frozen beside the shattered tray, one hand still pressed lightly against her cheek as tiny pieces of crystal sparkled across the marble floor around her shoes. She could feel every eye in the ballroom watching her now, not with sympathy, but with the cold curiosity wealthy people often reserved for public embarrassment. Claudia Harrington crossed her arms slowly, clearly expecting security to drag Ava away at any second. Instead, nobody moved, because Vincent Moretti had not looked away once. At the far end of the ballroom, his expression remained unreadable, but the men seated beside him had gone completely still. Luca Moretti, Vincent's cousin and head of security, leaned slightly closer. "Boss?" he asked carefully. Vincent did not answer immediately. His dark eyes stayed fixed on Ava as she crouched down to gather broken pieces of glass before anyone could step on them. Even now, humiliated in front of hundreds of people, she was still trying to protect strangers from getting hurt. That detail settled somewhere deep inside Vincent's chest in a way he could not explain. Claudia let out a soft laugh, the kind designed to make other people join in. "Look at her," she said loudly, lifting her champagne glass toward nearby guests. "She is still cleaning after ruining a $10,000 gown." A few nervous chuckles spread through the crowd. Ava kept her eyes lowered. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for another broken shard near her feet. She knew this feeling, the feeling of becoming smaller while people with power watched you suffer like entertainment. She had experienced it at 16 while working late shifts at a diner in Queens. She had experienced it again when a landlord laughed at her mother for falling behind on rent after chemotherapy treatments became too expensive. People with money always seemed to believe dignity belonged only to them. "I said, look at me when I'm speaking to you," Claudia snapped suddenly. Ava slowly raised her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." Claudia stepped closer, white satin brushing against the marble floor. "Do you know why women like me succeed?" she asked softly. "Because we do not make careless mistakes." Ava swallowed hard. Her throat felt tight now. "I apologized, ma'am." Claudia tilted her head slightly, studying her like an object she regretted purchasing. "Apologies do not erase class," she replied coldly. The words landed heavier than the slap itself. Around them, guests shifted uncomfortably, but nobody interrupted. Nobody challenged her. That was how rooms like this worked. Power protected power. Vincent finally stood. The movement was slow, controlled, but the instant he rose to his feet, tension swept through the ballroom like cold air before a storm. Several guests instinctively stepped backward without even realizing it. Vincent adjusted the sleeve of his charcoal suit calmly before beginning to walk across the marble floor. His polished shoes echoed through the silence one measured step at a time. Claudia's confident smile flickered for the first time that night. "Vincent," she said quickly, forcing a laugh. "You saw what happened. She ruined my dress." Vincent ignored her completely. Instead, his attention remained on Ava. Her breathing had become shallow now, but she still stood with quiet dignity despite the humiliation burning in her eyes. As Vincent stopped in front of her, Ava finally understood why people feared him. It was not because he raised his voice, it was because he never needed to. His presence alone changed the air around him. Then something caught Vincent's attention beneath the ballroom lights. As Ava bent slightly to place another broken crystal piece onto the tray, a small silver cross slipped from beneath the collar of her uniform. Vincent froze instantly. The color drained from his face so subtly that almost nobody noticed it except Luca. Vincent stared at the necklace as if he had just seen a ghost. For a long moment, Vincent Moretti said nothing at all. The ballroom remained frozen around him, wrapped in a silence so complete that even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. His dark eyes stayed locked on the small silver cross resting against Ava Brooks's uniform. It was simple, worn smooth around the edges from years of being touched and carried close to the heart. But Vincent knew every detail of that necklace. He remembered the tiny scratch near the center where his mother had accidentally dropped it against a kitchen sink years ago. He remembered giving it to her on her 65th birthday after she survived heart surgery. And he remembered standing beside her hospital bed 6 months earlier when nurses told him the necklace had disappeared sometime during her final days at St. Gabriel Hospice. Vincent's jaw tightened slowly. "Where did you get that cross?" he asked quietly. The question caught Ava off guard. She blinked once, still shaken from the humiliation burning across her face. "I am sorry." Vincent stepped closer. Not threatening, not loud, but suddenly the entire ballroom felt smaller around him. "The necklace," he repeated calmly. "Who gave it to you?" Claudia Harrington let out an impatient sigh beside them. "Vincent, seriously, we are discussing jewelry now." He ignored her completely. Ava hesitated before answering carefully. "An elderly woman gave it to me at St. Gabriel Hospice." Vincent's expression changed almost invisibly. "What was her name?" Ava looked down briefly, as though speaking the memory aloud required gentleness. "Eleanor Moretti." The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Several guests exchanged confused glances, while Luca straightened slightly near the back of the room, immediately understanding why Vincent had frozen. Ava continued softly, unaware that the most feared man in New York was struggling to steady his breathing. "I worked nights there before my mother got sick. Ms. Eleanor stayed in room 214. Vincent stared at her now with a completely different expression. Not cold, not calculating, something deeper, something dangerous in an entirely different way. Ava swallowed before continuing. She used to get scared after midnight sometimes, especially when the nurses changed shifts. So I would sit with her until she fell asleep. The ballroom no longer existed for Vincent. In his mind, he saw flashes of his mother during those final weeks. Frail hands resting beneath white hospital blankets. Her tired smile during their last phone call. The guilt he carried every day for not being there enough while building an empire that suddenly felt worthless beside memories of her dying alone. "She talked about you all the time," Ava said quietly. Vincent's eyes lifted sharply back to hers. What did she say? Ava gave the faintest smile despite everything that had happened tonight. She said her son pretended to be made of stone. A few guests shifted awkwardly nearby, sensing they were witnessing something deeply personal they were never meant to hear. Claudia crossed her arms impatiently. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "Vincent, she is a maid. She probably made the whole story up. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody moved." Ava's expression fell immediately at the accusation, But she did not defend herself. She simply lowered her eyes again, the same way people do when life has taught them dignity matters more than winning arguments. Vincent noticed that too. He noticed the trembling exhaustion in her hands, the faded scar near her wrist from years of hard work, the way she kept apologizing for existing in spaces built to remind people like her they did not belong. Then Ava spoke softly again. The night before she passed away, she gave me the necklace because I told her my mother could not afford surgery. Vincent felt something shift violently inside his chest. She said faith only matters when you share it with someone who is losing hope. The room went completely silent, and for the first time in years, Vincent Moretti looked at someone with something dangerously close to emotion in his eyes. The air inside the Grand Regent Ballroom felt different now, heavier, as if every person in the room suddenly understood they were standing too close to something fragile and dangerous at the same time. Ava Brooks lowered her eyes after speaking, unaware that her quiet words had just cracked open a part of Vincent Moretti he had spent years burying beneath power, money, and fear. Across the ballroom, crystal chandeliers still glowed warmly against polished marble and gold-trimmed walls. But the luxury suddenly felt hollow, meaningless. Vincent could still hear his mother's voice in his memory, soft, patient, always defending people others overlooked. He remembered the countless arguments they used to have whenever she volunteered at shelters and churches in Brooklyn. Kindness is the only thing people remember at the end, she used to tell him. Back then, Vincent had dismissed those words as weakness. Now, standing in front of the exhausted black maid his mother trusted during her final nights alive, he realized Eleanor Moretti had probably died knowing more peace with Ava beside her than she ever felt around his armed guards and expensive doctors. Claudia Harrington clearly sensed the atmosphere shifting away from her, and she hated it instantly. "Vincent," she said sharply, forcing confidence back into her voice, "you cannot seriously be taking the word of a hotel maid over mine." Vincent turned his head slowly toward her for the first time since crossing the ballroom. The look in his eyes made her voice falter. "Do you know what my mother feared most before she died?" he asked quietly. Claudia blinked in confusion. What Vincent's expression remained calm, but every person nearby leaned in slightly without realizing it. "Being alone," he said. "She spent her whole life surrounded by people pretending to care about her because of my name. But this woman stayed beside her when there was nothing to gain." Ava looked up slightly at that, startled by the respect in his voice. Claudia crossed her arms tighter. "That does not change the fact that she embarrassed me in front of everyone tonight." Vincent glanced briefly toward the stain on Claudia's gown. "Champagne dries," he replied calmly. "Humiliation does not." The words landed across the ballroom like a sudden drop in temperature. Several guests looked away immediately. Nobody wanted Vincent Moretti's attention on them when his voice became that quiet. Ava stood motionless between them, her pulse racing beneath the soft collar of her uniform. Part of her wanted to disappear completely. She had worked enough jobs in wealthy spaces to know what happened when powerful people turned against each other. Workers like her were usually the first to suffer. "Sir," she said softly, forcing herself to speak despite the knot in her throat. "I never meant to cause problems tonight." Vincent looked back at her instantly. "You did not." 3 simple words, but nobody in the ballroom missed what they meant. Claudia let out a disbelieving laugh. "You are defending her?" she asked. Over a spilled drink, Vincent slipped one hand calmly into the pocket of his charcoal suit. "No," he answered. "I am responding to character." Claudia's face tightened. Around her, the same guests who had laughed moments earlier now avoided eye contact completely. People who once rushed to stand near her suddenly took subtle steps backward, because in rooms ruled by power, loyalty changed direction very quickly. Ava noticed it too, the isolation, the invisible shift. One moment Claudia had owned the ballroom. The next, she was standing alone in the center of it. Luca approached quietly beside Vincent and lowered his voice. "The Harrington deal documents are ready for your signature upstairs." Several nearby investors stiffened instantly at those words. Ava did not understand the significance, but Claudia certainly did. Her family's company had spent nearly 2 years trying to secure Vincent Moretti's private investment network. Billions of dollars depended on tonight. Claudia's confidence flickered again as she stepped closer carefully. "Vincent," she said softer now, "let us not ruin an important evening over a misunderstanding." Vincent studied her silently for a long moment. Then his eyes drifted downward toward Ava's trembling hands, still carrying broken pieces of crystal from the floor. And something inside him hardened completely. The silence inside the ballroom no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt dangerous. Claudia Harrington noticed it first in the faces around her. The same people who had laughed beside her minutes earlier now stared into their champagne glasses or adjusted their cuffs or suddenly found the ceiling decorations fascinating. Nobody wanted to stand too close to her while Vincent Moretti was thinking. Because everyone in Manhattan knew one thing about Vincent. His decisions were never emotional. They were final. Ava Brooks slowly lowered the broken crystal pieces onto the silver tray in her trembling hands. Her cheek still burned faintly beneath the ballroom lights. But somehow that humiliation no longer felt like the center of the room. Vincent had changed the balance of power simply by standing there. Ava could feel it in the air. She wished desperately that she could disappear before things became worse. "Sir," she said softly again, careful with every word. "Please do not cause trouble because of me." Vincent looked at her for a long moment. There was no pity in his eyes. Somehow that mattered more. "You think this is because of you?" he asked quietly. Ava hesitated. "I spilled the drink." Vincent's expression remained unreadable. "No," he replied calmly. "You revealed people." Across the ballroom, a few guests shifted uneasily. Claudia folded her arms tighter across her chest. "This is absurd," she snapped. "You are turning a simple accident into some moral performance." Vincent turned toward her slowly. "No, Claudia," he said. "You did that yourself." The words landed hard enough to make several investors nearby glance nervously at one another. Claudia noticed it immediately. Her family had spent years building influence in rooms like this, and influence only survived when powerful people respected you. For the first time that evening, uncertainty flickered openly across her face. "Vincent," she said carefully now, lowering her voice, "let us speak privately upstairs." Vincent did not move. Why? Claudia forced a small laugh. Because emotions are clearly running high. Vincent glanced toward Ava again. She stood quietly beneath the chandeliers with her shoulders tense, trying to make herself smaller despite every eye in the ballroom still resting on her. Her uniform sleeve was slightly damp from spilled champagne. Tiny pieces of shattered crystal still clung near the hem of her shoes, and yet she remained composed. No screaming, no insults, no attempt to embarrass anyone back, just dignity. The kind his mother spent years trying to teach him mattered more than wealth ever would. Vincent exhaled slowly through his nose. Then he spoke without raising his voice at all. "Luca." "Yes, boss, bring me the Harrington contracts." A visible ripple moved through the ballroom. Investors exchanged alarmed looks instantly. Claudia's face lost color. "Vincent," she said sharply, "do not do something dramatic over this." Luca disappeared briefly toward the private conference room near the balcony, while tension spread through the gala like smoke. Nobody resumed drinking. Nobody returned to conversation. Even the musicians sat frozen with instruments resting silently in their laps. Ava's heartbeat pounded harder now. She had no idea what kind of business existed between Vincent and Claudia's family, but she understood enough to know something enormous was shifting because of her. "I should leave," she whispered quietly. Vincent's eyes moved back to her immediately. "No." The single word stopped her completely. Claudia stared at him in disbelief. "You are protecting her?" she asked. Vincent adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit calmly. "I am respecting the last person who showed kindness to my mother without expecting anything in return." Claudia opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out, because deep down, she understood something horrifying in that moment. This was no longer about a spilled drink. It was no longer about public embarrassment or damaged pride or a stained gown worth $10,000. This had become personal. Luca returned, carrying a black leather folder thick with legal documents. He handed it silently to Vincent. The room watched as Vincent opened the folder slowly beneath the chandelier light. Billions of dollars rested inside those pages. Partnerships, investments, access to one of the most powerful private financial networks on the East Coast. Claudia took one step forward instinctively. "Vincent," she said carefully, almost pleading now, "my father is expecting your signature tonight." Vincent looked down briefly at the contracts. Then he closed the folder without signing a single page. The soft snap of leather echoing shut sounded louder than thunder inside the silent ballroom. The sound of the leather folder closing seemed to drain all warmth from the ballroom. Claudia Harrington stared at Vincent Moretti as though she no longer recognized the man standing in front of her. Around them, the city's wealthiest investors sat perfectly still beneath the crystal chandeliers, understanding that they were witnessing something far more dangerous than anger. They were watching respect disappear. Vincent rested one hand calmly on top of the unsigned contracts while the silence stretched painfully through the room. Ava Brooks stood a few feet away, clutching the empty silver tray against her uniform, her heartbeat still racing beneath the soft ballroom lights. She could not understand why all of this was happening because of her. She was just trying to survive another shift, just another exhausted woman balancing overdue bills, hospital appointments for her mother, and 12-hour workdays that left her feet aching before sunrise. Yet somehow, the most powerful man in the room was looking at her as though she mattered. Claudia finally forced herself to speak again. "Vincent," she said carefully, "you are embarrassing me in front of everyone." Vincent lifted his eyes toward her slowly. "Interesting," he replied calmly. "You did not seem concerned about embarrassment 15 minutes ago." Several guests lowered their heads immediately. Nobody wanted to be caught reacting. Claudia's jaw tightened. "You are destroying a business relationship over a maid." Vincent's expression remained completely still. "No," he said softly. "I am ending a business relationship because of character." The words hit harder than any shouted accusation could have. Claudia looked around the ballroom desperately now, searching for support from the same people who had spent years praising her family. But nobody stepped forward. Nobody defended her. Because everyone understood one brutal truth about New York power circles. Once Vincent Moretti decided you no longer deserved his respect, standing beside you became dangerous. Luca quietly collected the unsigned contracts from the table while several investors exchanged nervous whispers near the back of the ballroom. Claudia noticed immediately. "You cannot be serious," she said, her voice cracking slightly for the first time. "Do you understand what cancelling this partnership means?" Vincent looked at her without emotion. "Perfectly." Claudia stepped closer. "Our companies have spent 2 years building this arrangement." Vincent nodded once. "Then perhaps you should have spent 2 seconds treating another human being with dignity." The room fell silent again. Ava felt tears sting her eyes unexpectedly, but she blinked them back quickly. Nobody had ever defended her like this before. Not at the diner in Queens where customers snapped their fingers at her like she was invisible. Not at the nursing home where wealthy families ignored workers caring for their parents every night. And certainly not in rooms filled with people who measured human worth by the price of a wristwatch or the zip code on a business card. Vincent noticed the tears she was trying to hide. His voice softened slightly when he spoke to her. "Ava." She looked up immediately. "Yes, sir." Vincent glanced toward the broken crystal still scattered across the marble floor near her feet. Leave that. Ava hesitated instinctively. But the mess. Leave it, he repeated quietly. Something about the way he said it made her hands finally loosen around the tray. For the first time all evening, she stopped trying to clean up damage she did not deserve. Claudia stared at Vincent in disbelief. You are choosing her over billions of dollars. Vincent adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit slowly. No amount of money impresses me anymore, he replied, especially from people who mistake cruelty for status. A heavy silence settled over the ballroom again. Then Vincent turned slightly toward the investors seated nearby. Ladies and gentlemen, he said calmly, the Harrington agreement is terminated effective immediately. The reaction was instant. Several executives exchanged alarmed looks. One investor quietly reached for his phone. Another slowly stood from his chair as though trying to distance himself from the disaster unfolding in real time. Claudia's face went pale beneath the chandelier light. You cannot do this, she whispered. Vincent finally looked directly into her eyes. I already did. And in that moment, surrounded by wealth, diamonds, and people who spent their lives chasing power, Claudia Harrington realized something terrifying. The maid she slapped had just become the most protected woman in the ballroom. For several seconds after Vincent Moretti terminated the Harrington agreement, nobody in the ballroom moved at all. The silence hanging beneath the crystal chandeliers no longer felt elegant. It felt suffocating. Claudia Harrington stood motionless near the center of the room, her perfectly controlled social mask beginning to crack beneath hundreds of watching eyes. Around her, wealthy investors and executives quietly recalculated their loyalties in real time. In rooms ruled by money, survival often depended on sensing power shifts before anyone else did, and tonight, the shift had been brutal. Ava Brooks remained frozen beside the shattered crystal on the marble floor, still trying to process what had just happened. Her entire body felt numb. She had walked into work tonight worried about subway delays, hospital bills, and whether her mother had remembered to take her medication before bed. Now the most feared businessman in New York had publicly dismantled a billion-dollar partnership because someone humiliated her. It did not feel real. Claudia finally found her voice again, though it sounded thinner now. Vincent, she said carefully, you are making a mistake you cannot undo. Vincent turned toward her slowly. His expression remained calm, almost coldly polite. No, he replied. The mistake happened when you believed kindness was weakness. Claudia laughed nervously, but the sound lacked confidence now. You are willing to destroy years of business because she worked at a hospice. Vincent's eyes darkened slightly. No, he said softly. Because she stayed beside my mother when people with status were too busy protecting their schedules. The words settled heavily across the ballroom. Ava lowered her eyes again, overwhelmed by the attention surrounding her. She remembered those quiet nights at St. Gabriel Hospice so clearly now. Eleanor Moretti sitting near the window wrapped in pale blue blankets. The scent of lavender lotion in the room. The way the elderly woman smiled whenever Ava sneaked her extra vanilla pudding cups from the cafeteria because hospital food made her lose her appetite. Back then, Ava had no idea Eleanor's son controlled half the financial world standing inside this ballroom tonight. To her, Eleanor had simply been lonely. Vincent noticed Ava drifting into memory. Did she suffer? He asked quietly. The question changed the atmosphere instantly. Gone was the feared businessman. Gone was the ruthless strategist every newspaper whispered about. For one brief moment, he was simply a son asking about his mother. Ava looked up carefully. No, she answered softly. Not at the end. Vincent's jaw tightened. Ava continued gently, her voice almost trembling now. She used to wait for your phone calls every evening. Pain flickered across Vincent's face before disappearing just as quickly. Several guests looked away respectfully. Even when you missed them, Ava added carefully, she still defended you. Vincent lowered his eyes briefly. The room had never seen him vulnerable before. Claudia noticed it too, and desperation flashed across her face. "Vincent," she said quickly, stepping closer again. "Everyone here knows emotions cloud judgment. Let us handle this privately." Vincent slowly lifted his eyes back toward her. "You still do not understand," he said calmly. Claudia's breathing became uneven now. "Understand what?" Vincent glanced toward Ava, standing quietly beneath the chandeliers. "This woman showed my mother more humanity during her final weeks than most people in this room have shown anyone in years. Nobody spoke, nobody interrupted, because deep down, many of them knew he was right." The ballroom was filled with people who donated millions to charity galas while ignoring workers carrying trays beside them every day. People who applauded speeches about compassion while humiliating anyone beneath their social status the moment cameras disappeared. Vincent looked around the ballroom slowly. "Money can buy influence," he said quietly, "but it cannot buy class." Several executives lowered their heads immediately. Claudia's face burned with humiliation now. She was no longer controlling the room. She had become the example. Ava noticed it too, and strangely, she did not feel satisfaction, only sadness, because she knew humiliation hurt no matter who experienced it. Vincent turned back toward Ava once more. "You should not be standing tonight," he said softly, glancing toward the broken crystal near her feet. "You should be sitting." Before Ava could respond, Vincent pulled out one of the empty chairs from the private investors' table beside him. The gesture was simple, quiet, but every person in the ballroom understood exactly what it meant. And for the second time that night, the room went completely silent. No one in the Grand Regent ballroom had ever seen Vincent Moretti pull out a chair for anyone. Not politicians, not investors, not celebrities desperate for his approval. Yet beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers and the watchful eyes of Manhattan's elite, he stood beside the private investors' table with one hand resting calmly on the back of the chair, waiting for Ava Brooks to sit down. The silence surrounding the moment felt almost unreal. Ava stared at him in confusion, still clutching the empty silver tray against her chest like a shield. "Sir," she whispered carefully, "I cannot sit there." Vincent's expression remained steady. Why not? Ava glanced nervously toward the table filled with billion-dollar investors and luxury executives wearing watches worth more than her apartment building. "Because that is not my place." Something shifted in Vincent's eyes at those words. Not anger, something sadder. "Who taught you that?" he asked quietly. Ava lowered her gaze immediately. She did not answer because people like her learned it everywhere. In restaurants, where managers told workers not to make eye contact with wealthy customers. In hospitals, where janitors ate lunch in hidden break rooms while executives dined upstairs. In life itself. Vincent slowly pulled the chair back another inch. "Sit, Ava." Around the ballroom, guests watched with stunned disbelief as the exhausted black maid who had spent the evening carrying champagne trays slowly lowered herself into a chair worth more than her monthly salary. The room almost seemed unable to process the image. Claudia Harrington certainly could not. "This is insane," she snapped suddenly. "You are humiliating me now on purpose." Vincent finally turned toward her again, but his voice stayed calm. "No, Claudia," he replied softly. "Tonight you are simply experiencing what accountability feels like." Claudia's face tightened beneath the chandelier light. Nearby investors remained silent, careful not to involve themselves, while Vincent Moretti dismantled one of Manhattan's most connected families with nothing more than quiet words. Ava sat stiffly at the edge of the chair, overwhelmed by the attention surrounding her. Her hands remained folded tightly in her lap, while servers and guests alike stared at her as though she had crossed some invisible line society never intended people like her to cross. Vincent noticed immediately. "You look uncomfortable," he said quietly. Ava forced a small smile. "I am not used to this." Vincent glanced around the ballroom slowly. Neither are they. A few guests quickly looked away, after realizing he had caught them staring. Then, without warning, Vincent reached for the untouched dinner plate sitting beside his seat and placed it gently in front of Ava. The gesture was simple, respectful, human, but the effect it had on the ballroom was immediate. A woman near the back actually gasped softly, because everyone understood what Vincent was doing now. He was not just protecting Ava, he was restoring her dignity in front of the same room that watched it being stripped away. "You have not eaten tonight, have you?" Vincent asked quietly. Ava hesitated before answering honestly, "No, sir." Vincent looked toward one of the servers standing frozen nearby. "Bring her a fresh meal." The server nodded instantly and hurried toward the kitchen. Ava looked stunned. "You do not have to do this." Vincent's eyes softened slightly. "Yes," he said quietly, "I do." The ballroom remained silent except for the faint clinking of silverware somewhere near the back. Claudia stood alone now, near the center of the room. Abandoned by the same social circle that once surrounded her constantly, nobody stood beside her anymore, nobody laughed at her comments, nobody rushed to defend her reputation, because Vincent Moretti had already decided where dignity belonged tonight. Ava looked down at the untouched plate in front of her, struggling to steady the emotions rising inside her chest. She had spent so many years feeling invisible that kindness now felt harder to process than cruelty. Vincent noticed the faint trembling in her hands again. "My mother trusted you," he said quietly. "That means something to me." Ava swallowed hard before answering. "She was very kind to me." Vincent looked down briefly, the grief in his eyes impossible to fully hide now. "You gave her peace during her final days," he said softly. "I can never repay that debt." And for the first time all evening, Ava Brooks felt something she had almost forgotten. People like her deserved to feel inside rooms like this. Respect. The atmosphere inside the Grand Regent ballroom had completely changed by the time fresh food arrived at the investors' table for Ava Brooks. Earlier that evening, she had been invisible, just another exhausted worker balancing silver trays beneath crystal chandeliers while wealthy strangers laughed around her. Now every eye in the room followed her carefully, not because of pity, but because Vincent Moretti had decided she deserved respect. And in Manhattan, the opinion of Vincent Moretti could reshape entire lives overnight. Ava sat quietly at the edge of the chair, still struggling to understand how the evening had transformed so completely. The fresh plate of food in front of her remained untouched for several moments because her hands would not stop trembling. Vincent noticed immediately. "You should eat," he said softly. Ava looked down, embarrassed by the attention. "I am sorry," she whispered automatically. Vincent's expression tightened slightly. "Stop apologizing for existing in this room." The words landed deep inside her chest. Around them, investors exchanged silent glances. Nobody dared interrupt. Nobody even reached for their phones anymore. It felt as though the entire ballroom understood they were witnessing something far more important than a business deal collapsing. They were watching a woman reclaim dignity she should never have lost in the first place. Across the marble floor, Claudia Harrington remained standing alone beneath the chandelier lights, abandoned by nearly everyone who had surrounded her earlier. Several executives had already quietly distanced themselves from her table. Others suddenly remembered urgent phone calls or meetings elsewhere. In powerful circles, reputation moved faster than loyalty. Claudia finally looked toward Ava directly, but the arrogance in her expression had vanished. Only humiliation remained. Ava noticed it immediately. And strangely, she did not feel victorious. She only looked tired. Vincent followed her gaze. "You are not angry with her?" he asked quietly. Ava hesitated before answering honestly, "No, sir." Vincent seemed surprised. Ava looked down briefly at the silver cross resting against her uniform. "People who humiliate others usually carry unhappiness inside themselves," she said softly. "My mother used to say, wounded people try to wound others." Several guests nearby lowered their eyes at those words. Even Claudia looked shaken by them. Vincent studied Ava silently for a long moment. Then something rare appeared in his expression. Respect without calculation. "My mother would have liked hearing that," he said quietly. Ava smiled faintly for the first time all evening. She already did. Silence settled softly across the ballroom again, but this time it no longer felt cold. It felt reflective, human. Vincent slowly stood from the table, adjusting the sleeve of his charcoal suit beneath the golden chandelier light. Immediately, the room straightened instinctively around him. He looked toward Luca. "Make sure Ms. Brooks gets home safely tonight." "Of course, boss." Ava quickly shook her head. "That is not necessary." Vincent looked at her calmly. "It is to me." The simple sincerity in his voice nearly brought tears back to her eyes. For years, Ava had worked through invisible spaces where nobody asked if she was safe getting home after midnight shifts. Nobody cared whether she ate dinner. Nobody noticed when exhaustion sat heavy beneath her smile. Yet tonight, in the middle of Manhattan's most powerful ballroom, someone finally did. Vincent glanced one final time around the room filled with wealth, designer gowns, luxury watches, and carefully rehearsed status. Then he spoke quietly enough that nobody should have heard him. Yet somehow everyone did. "Money reveals people," he said, "but kindness defines them." No one answered. No one challenged him. Because deep down, every person standing beneath those crystal chandeliers knew the truth of it. Claudia Harrington had entered the ballroom believing status made her untouchable. Ava Brooks had entered believing she did not belong there at all. But by the end of the night, only one of them walked away with dignity intact. Ava rose slowly from the table, holding the small silver cross gently between her fingers as Luca escorted her toward the ballroom exit. Guests moved aside quietly to let her pass, not out of fear, out of respect. And as the grand doors opened beneath the soft Manhattan lights beyond the lobby windows, the room remained completely silent behind her. Because that night, the richest people in New York finally remembered what dignity looked like.